We're finally back from Computex with jet lag and trade show fever, but alas, there is more work to be done. And after what feels like a long wait, AMD has finally dropped their latest mainstream contender, the Radeon RX 9060 XT. Following on from the higher-end 9070 and 9070 XT, this new GPU is positioned to tackle the competitive mid-range market, aiming kind of squarely at NVIDIA's RTX 5060 and 5060 Ti graphics cards. Available in both 8GB and 16GB configurations with aggressive MSRPs of $299 and $349 respectively, AMD is clearly looking to shake things up and offer gamers a compelling value proposition. Of particular interest for many will be the 16GB variant that we have here today, while the 8GB model I guess is positioned to hit that attractive sub-$300 price point. The current landscape of gaming in 2025 just has many feelings that 8GB of VRAM simply isn't enough for modern titles, especially as textures and resolutions continue to increase. Thankfully, as mentioned, we have the 16GB RX 9060 XT on our test bench today, which we anticipate will offer a much more future-proof experience, and crucially, address some of those lingering concerns about memory limitations that have plagued previous generations of mainstream cards. Boasting the latest RDNA 4 architecture and with a strong emphasis on improved ray tracing and FSR4 upscaling technology, the RX 9060 XT promises a significant step up, particularly for 1080p and even 1440p gaming. But as we've seen time and time again, MSRPs don't always tell the full story, and the real-world performance and pricing will be crucial. So, will the RX 9060 XT deliver on its promises and become the new mainstream champion, or will it fall victim to inflated pricing and real-world bottlenecks? That's precisely what we're here to find out. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
Alright, stay calm. You've got one job. Do not let this thing overheat.
It's running hot. I don't know if it's safe.
Get the WireView Pro.
The WireView Pro safeguards your graphics card with real-time power and temperature monitoring, acoustic alarms for custom thresholds, and sensor pin detection to ensure proper 12V PWR connection. External sensors can monitor additional components like memory or voltage regulators, while an OLED display provides instant insights, meaning that this is the last time you'll blow a 12V PWR connector, soldier. To keep your system protected, click the link in the description below.
With the release of the 9060 XT, AMD are making some very bold claims of being the world's best graphics card under $350. While I'm sure Intel and NVIDIA would have something to say about that, there's also no basis behind it, because what's the meaning of being the world's best? As gamers have become disenfranchised from all the marketing spiel from all camps as of late, I think those words need to be taken with a very big grain of salt, especially as while this could, at least on paper, launch at $350, if history has taught us anything, though NVIDIA I guess have had it worse, pricing can be a very big point of contention. Now, naming structure to one side, the 9060 XT is regarded as the successor to the Radeon RX 7600 XT, which ended up receiving a mixed reception when it launched from both reviewers and gamers. While it offered certain improvements over its predecessor, the RX 7600, many felt that these enhancements didn't justify the increased price, of which we're talking around 8% at 1080p and 5% at 1440p, and still lagged behind older generation cards like the 6700 XT. Now, one thing that it did offer was a higher capacity of VRAM, coming in at 16GB. And while I'd like to say that AMD have learnt their lesson with the newer 9060 XT, that's just not the case, as there are two SKUs launching today, and I fear, much like other cards that we've seen with 8GB of VRAM, that it will be dead on arrival, at least in the DIY segment of the market. And after speaking to some AIBs at Computex recently, it does seem like they'll be pushing the lesser model more towards system integrators for those who want a cheap system that will run fairly basic games for their kids' first PC. So in comparison, at least to the 7600 XT, we have a card that is launching for another $20 and comes packing, well, the same amount of memory, same type of memory being GDDR6 and the same interface of 128-bit, which matches similar offerings from NVIDIA, though at least they've used GDDR7 to, I guess, help push their product, though even that, for some, just, well, hasn't done enough. What is interesting is that AMD won't have an NBA version or reference card for this class of GPU either, and are instead reliant on AIB partners. But again, speaking to them at Computex, there was definitely a level of hesitancy when pressed on samples of the 8GB model. I guess this will end up going by the wayside, and while some reviewers out there may get their hands on one, though likely that will mean actually buying one from a retailer or working directly with them, as I'm sure AMD want to mitigate any bad press on this launch, as the 8GB model could actually bring down the general consensus on both the 8GB and 16GB models collectively. For today, we have the 16GB model to review, and spec-wise, well, not all too much has changed from the 7600 XT. Of course, we have a different manufacturing process favouring TSMC's N4P node, and we use the Navi 44 GPU core, which is the first card to utilise this particular silicon. We do see slightly smaller in terms of the die size compared to the 7600 XT, while also packing in 123% more transistors. Other specs though, well, they really don't change at all, as we have the same amount of compute units, stream processors, ray accelerators, ROPs, and texture mapping units, though we do see a small decrease in the total board power from 190 watts to a maximum of 180 watts, which will range from SKU to SKU, and a reference spec would actually be, well, 160 watts. In terms of clock speeds, these have seen a modest bump of 2% on the game clock, a little under 14% on the boost clock, and around 11% in terms of the memory clock. So nothing earth-shattering, but coupled with the architectural improvements, we should see a difference in performance at least, but by how much is yet to be seen. As mentioned, with there being no NBA or reference cards for this launch, we have the Nitro Plus model from Sapphire, as well as the XFX SWFT. They're both pre-factory overclocked, and while we'll be looking at cooling performance on both, we've put the Nitro Plus model through our full testing suite to see exactly how the GPU stacks up. To test, we used our GPU benchmark system with an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D processor and 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB 6000MHz CL30 memory on a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master motherboard. All testing was done on the latest version of Windows with the latest updates, and for our testing we used the AMD Adrenalin 25.10.09.01 press driver. Due to the specs and pricing of this card and where AMD are actually positioning it, we'll be putting our focus on 1080p and 1440p here today because, well, 4K is going to be out of reach for the most part unless you're utilising upscaling. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. First up, to make sure that things are aligning as we'd expect, we loaded up into 3D Mark Timespy Extreme, and here we see the 9060 XT falling just behind the 7700 XT in both the score and the graphics score. We do, however, see a 35% increase over the 7600 XT and a 4% lead over the more expensive 5060 Ti. Now, synthetics to one side, and in a Plague Tale at 1080p, the 9060 XT averaged 101 FPS. This puts it 2% ahead of the 5060 Ti from NVIDIA, while also seeing a sizable 42% increase over the 7600 XT. At 1440p, the gap widens slightly, with the 9060 XT pushing 4% ahead of the 5060 Ti and 45% faster than the 7600 XT, coming in at 71 FPS, which also puts it just 2 frames behind the RX 7700 XT. Moving on to Alan Wake 2, and now the 9060 XT pushes slightly ahead of the 7700 XT, while retaining a lead over the 5060 Ti of a healthier 8%, along with 43% faster performance than the 7600 XT from last generation. Bumping the resolution up to 1440p, and the 9060 XT still holds a small lead of a couple of frames over the 7700 XT, but more importantly still comes in 7% faster than the 5060 Ti, while also increasing its lead over the 7600 XT, now by a margin of 51%. In Baldur's Gate 3, the 9060 XT came in 8% slower than the 5060 Ti, while simultaneously pushing 6% more performance compared to the RTX 5060, and coming in only 21% faster than the 7600 XT. Increasing the resolution to 1440p, and again the 5060 Ti edges it, as the 9060 XT comes in 9% slower, while still coming in 10% faster than the RTX 5060 and 22% faster than the 7600 XT. Switching over to Black Myth Wukong, the 9060 XT essentially matches the performance levels of the 7700 XT, separated by a single frame per second, and giving a solid 47% lead over the 7600 XT. Unfortunately for AMD, the 9060 XT now sits 6% behind the 5060 Ti, though considering the price disparity, I'd still chalk that up as a win for the red team. At 1440p, it's much of the same story, with similar performance to the 7700 XT, while also sitting 9% behind the 5060 Ti, but matching the 5060 non-Ti and still coming in with a strong uplift of 45% over the predecessor 7600 XT. In Counter-Strike 2, the 9060 XT was 5% slower than the 5060 Ti, but more than made up for it in the 1% lows, an area where NVIDIA can be, well, a bit hit or miss. The uplift over the 7600 XT is now much smaller too, at just 22%, but at such high frame rates, it's nothing any gamer would ever notice, but it's still enough to come in 6% faster than the RTX 5060, which comes in with, well, frankly, terrible 1% low figures to boot. At 1440p, things look quite bad for the 9060 XT, essentially matching performance of the RTX 5060. Though again, the 1% low figures for NVIDIA are a real bad point of contention, and AMD still show a sizable 21% increase over its older brother, the 7600 XT. In Cyberpunk, we see the 9060 XT flying, essentially matching performance of the 7800 XT from last generation, and coming in 27% faster than the RTX 5060 Ti, and seeing our strongest uplift over the 7600 XT so far of 63%. This also puts the RTX 5060 in a really bad situation, as AMD come in 43% ahead for, well, a 17% higher cost. At 1440p, performance on the 9060 XT and 5060 Ti aligns much more, with a 1 FPS difference in favour of AMD, while also coming in 16% faster than the 5060 8GB and 36% faster than the 7600 XT from yesteryear. F124 performance was a bit of a mixed bag. The 9060 XT now sits 7% below the 7700 XT, which until now had been much closer, though it's still enough at 287 FPS to come in 9% faster than NVIDIA's 5060 Ti, while also offering up 28% more frames than the 5060 non-Ti, and 38% more than the 7600 XT, still demonstrating a strong reason to upgrade. At 1440p, the 9060 XT slips slightly as it now sits 9% slower than the 7700 XT, but maintains a 10% lead over the 5060 Ti, a card that comes in $80 more expensive, all while strengthening its uplift over the 7600 XT, now back up to 44% faster. The 9060 XT didn't perform as well in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, now coming in 12% slower than the 5060 Ti, though due to price disparity, there's a lot more going on than first meets the eye. One saving grace for this game is how bad the 5060 8GB does, which helps push the 9060 XT 34% ahead of it at this resolution. Then at 1440p, I will mention a caveat in that, well, we had to reduce the texture pool size for our RTX 5060 test, otherwise it just, well, refused to run. Either way, this puts the 9060 XT 13% behind the 5060 Ti and 22% ahead of the RTX 5060, and holds a much healthier 48% lead over the RX 7600 XT. In Starfield, the 9060 XT comes in just behind the more expensive 5060 Ti by a margin of error 2 frames per second, while still striking 18% faster performance than the RTX 5060 and 39% more frames than the card is, well, essentially replacing the 7600 XT. Then at 1440p, the 9060 XT and 5060 Ti align the same, separated by 2 frames per second. This also puts the AMD card 19% faster than the 5060 8GB and 42% ahead of the 7600 XT, again showing, well, a worthwhile upgrade path. In our final rasterization test, we have War Thunder, and at 1080p, the 9060 XT delivered comparable performance to the 7800 XT, while also coming in 14% slower than the 5060 Ti. The 1440p results weren't as favourable, now essentially matching the 5060, but still giving 44% faster performance than the 7600 XT, which is, of course, the card that it's replacing. Now, across the 10 games tested, the 9060 XT comes in at 187 FPS, putting it just 4% behind the RTX 5060 Ti, which is a card that, well, commands a 23% higher cost if you can get it at MSRP. In terms of the 5060, the 9060 XT offers up 13% more performance on average, though it does come in 17% more expensive. Though what is nice to see is that the 9060 XT offers up 36% more performance on average compared to its predecessor, the 7600 XT. At 1440p, the 9060 XT offers up a similar outcome, trailing 6% behind the 5060 Ti, 10% ahead of the 5060, and coming in with a 35% overall uplift over the older 7600 XT. In terms of ray tracing performance, the RDNA 4-based GPU has a clear improvement over its RDNA 3 counterpart, offering up 73% faster performance over the 7600 XT, while also edging ahead of the RTX 5060 by 4%, though does still fall behind the 5060 Ti by around 13%. Then at 1440p, the 9060 XT again falls behind the 5060 Ti, this time by 15%. And holds the same 4% lead over the RTX 5060, but again shows the strong uplift over last generation with a 76% increase in performance. Moving over to Black Myth Wukong, it may not look great at just 25 frames per second, but this now narrowly beats out the 7900 XT, though this is more of a testament as to how lackluster last generation AMD cards were in terms of ray tracing, as it's still not enough to get even close to the RTX 5060's performance, which sits 56% ahead. Then there's no real change at 1440p either, and the chart kind of speaks for itself at just 15 FPS, showing that upscaling is a necessity in this title on, well, most modern day GPUs. In Cyberpunk again, but this time with ray tracing, we see a strong generational uplift over the 7600 XT of 118%, and is now at least, well, playable. And this also puts it 16% faster than the 5060 and only 8% behind the RTX 5060 Ti, so not bad overall. Though again, upscaling would give you a much better experience overall. 1440p sees some changes as the uplift grows in performance over the 7600 XT, now coming in 120% faster. And due to the 5060 giving, well, pretty dire performance, we now see AMD leading by 83%, though it does still fall 12% behind the 5060 Ti. In F124, AMD takes a win, coming in 4% faster than the 5060 Ti. May not be much of a margin, but, well, a win is still a win, especially when compared to NVIDIA, who are historically better in ray tracing-based games. Then at 1440p, it's very much the same story, with AMD pushing out 4% more performance over the more expensive 5060 Ti. So while on the cusp of margin of error, it does just edge it. Moving back to averages and looking at the 1080p ray tracing averages, due to those last results, we do see the 9060 XT falling behind the 5060 Ti by 10% and putting performance close to the 7800 XT from last generation. What is impressive though is the 77% uplift from the 7600 XT, showing that AMD have been hard at work on bringing ray tracing performance more in line with the competition. At 1440p, the 5060 Ti takes a slightly wider gap, with the RDNA 4 base card now sitting 13% behind, but does still have AMD 14% ahead of the RTX 5060, and does still have an impressive uplift, gen on gen, of 78%. So how do things stack up in the all-important cost per frame? Well, this is where things get interesting, as the RTX 5060 actually comes in the better buy at $1.81 per frame, though this isn't much different from the 9060 XT, which comes in at 5 cents more expensive per frame, but gives a 13% increase in overall frame rate. When it comes to 1440p, which I honestly think people buying this would be looking to play at, it's definitely good news, as the 9060 XT comes in as the second best value GPU you can buy right now, at just $2.61 per frame. Sadly, this comes with a pretty major sticking point in that, well, a lot of GPUs still aren't available at their MSRP prices, though it is getting better, and AMD generally does come out better than NVIDIA in this department. Now, what is going to be a thorn in AMD's side, however, is the RTX 5060, which comes in the better buy and performs just 9% worse. Though the big drawback there is the all-important VRAM, which is where AMD has the edge when, well, thinking about future-proofing. What's clear to see is that AMD does offer good value when it comes to cards with 16GB of VRAM, and, well, that's something that NVIDIA can't really compete with at the moment, as their best value 16GB card is the RTX 5060 Ti at $3.03 per frame, and again, $80 more in total. Switching things up, and when it comes to real-world selling prices, the 5060 still does well, as it is actually available at its MSRP of $299. And, well, this puts the RX 9060 XT into the same position as well, just behind by 5 cents per frame. Like we saw, well, at MSRP, though this is actually assuming that the new RDNA 4 base card will be available at that price. And, well, our retail sources do actually suggest that stock will be strong, and therefore it should be. What we do find though is cards like the 7700 XT and 5060 Ti now drop down slightly to be put into a kind of better light. But if you were eyeing up a 7700 XT, then the 9060 XT is actually the better choice given its similar performance, more VRAM, and newer technologies and architecture. At 1440p, which is again more realistic for this card, the 9060 XT still sits as the best buy card in this segment, if we're talking 16GB of VRAM minimum, with the next closest card being an older AMD 6000 series. Again, if you're wanting the best efficiency, performance per watt, latest tech like FSR and so on, then it's a bit of a no-brainer for this one. Even when compared to the RTX 5060, at 1440p it really starts to show that it's a bit of a letdown, as even though it's cheaper than the RDNA 4 card that we've looked at today, it's packing less performance and won't have the same level of longevity due to the VRAM. Now, as mentioned, we have the Nitro Plus model from Sapphire, which is likely going to be one of the top-tier models being released, and comes in with a pre-factory overclock. Along with that, looks-wise, it is essentially a slightly shrunk-down version of what we've seen on its higher-tier brothers, the RX 9070 and 9070 XT. Now, under our hour-long load test of F124, we found a very reasonable peak GPU temperature of 53 degrees, while the memory came in at a higher 82 degrees. Now, the fans did stay relatively quiet, which is something we're used to seeing with the Nitro Plus range at around 1500 RPM average, though this did see peaks around 1738 RPM, which is still silent enough to not be heard over the rest of your system's cooling. The power really did hit the limits at 183 watts peak, which is actually, well, above the 160 watt reference spec, though AMD do allow for higher limits, as the reference spec is more of a guideline rather than a cap. And they allow AIBs to go above and beyond, which would require a beefier power delivery system and cooler, which is something the Nitro Plus prides itself on. Now, unless you're going for a more basic model, this is actually pretty typical and still within reasonable expectations. In terms of the core clock, we did see clock speed behavior hovering around 2960 MHz for the most part, but on occasion we did see that jump to a little over 3000 MHz. And overall, the card performed very well. Now, the XFX card that we have came in slightly different. While the GPU temperatures were slightly higher at around 56 degrees, with the occasional peak of 57 degrees, the memory temperature stayed at a very steady 68 degrees throughout the test, with the fans also staying very quiet at just under 1300 RPM at its highest. But for the most part, we actually saw speeds as low as 980 RPM, making it, well, essentially silent. Power-wise, being a new card, there was clearly an error with HW info and displaying the power outputs, and once we're able to actually see that data, we will update you all on our social media channels, though it's more than likely to be exactly where you expect it to be, at kind of similar levels to the Sapphire card. Then, in terms of clock speed, while it didn't hit the same levels as Sapphire, it still ended up hovering around 2850 MHz or so, and had the occasional peaks at just under 2900 MHz, which, when compared to Sapphire, wouldn't really mean much, if anything, in terms of real-world performance. Focusing purely on performance, the RX 9060 XT delivers on what it was set out to do, by offering strong 1080p and competitive 1440p gaming experiences. Compared to its predecessor, the RX 7600 XT, it does offer up a substantial uplift, averaging 36% faster performance at 1080p and 35% at 1440p across rasterization tests, with even more significant gains in ray tracing of 77% at 1080 and 78% at 1440p. When pitting it side by side to the RTX 5060 and 5060 Ti, it generally competes very well, often outperforming the RTX 5060 by 13% at 1080 and 10% at 1440p, and proving to be a close contender to the more expensive RTX 5060 Ti, trailing by only 4% at 1080p and 6% at 1440p in rasterization, while also holding anywhere up to a 4% lead over the RTX 5060 in ray tracing, but falling behind the Ti by 10 to 15%. Now, the big one is always going to come down to pricing, and luckily AMD tend to fare better than its NVIDIA counterparts, even if not abundantly clear. Firstly, stock is generally pretty plentiful in comparison, and that's definitely going to be a saving grace for AMD, as it means we should see performance and pricing align much better in the real world of actually obtaining a card for the price it's meant to be. For us, well, it's always hard to recommend a launch day GPU, no matter the brand or tier, until we actually see the launch price and get a better lay of the land. So speculation does generally come into play. And if the 9060 XT kind of comes in for the expected price, then, well, its 16 gig model offers compelling value, particularly at 1440p, where it stands out as one of the best value GPUs. And that's making more of a comparison to the 5060 Ti 16 gig. What is clear to see is that unlike NVIDIA, AMD aren't solely relying on upscaling tech. While it does have FSR, and that's something that we will look at in an upcoming feature, they tend to push their marketing message around rasterization and ray tracing performance, while also offering better efficiency and focusing heavily on getting the price right. While the 9060 XT does come in $50 more expensive than the RTX 5060, it does pack double the VRAM, which, well, I guess is something that the community as a whole has been irked about regarding cards that feature 8GB of VRAM. And as I mentioned, I think the 8GB version of this card is a bit of a non-starter, though we'll do our best to get hold of one to see if that's actually the case. Comparing, like for like though, in terms of pitting the 9060 XT against the 5060 Ti 16GB, it's clear to see that the 9060 XT offers very similar rasterization performance while being priced significantly lower, providing a more attractive cost per frame. And while ray tracing performance still favours NVIDIA in some titles, AMD has clearly made significant strides, even taking wins in F124. And, given the slightly cheaper price of the AMD offering, it does position itself as a strong value proposition, especially for those prioritising rasterization performance and VRAM capacity over peak ray tracing in every title. Of course, the big one for NVIDIA is that they have the stronger brand compared to AMD. And well, due to that, they will sell no matter what, even if it's not in the huge numbers that they expect. And for the Red team, this puts them in a harder situation where marketing and buzzwords don't quite cut it. And instead, they have to rely on having a good product at a solid price. And for the most part, the 9060 XT delivers on that front, offering strong performance for its intended market segment, which is exactly what AMD set out to do with that bold statement. What is clear to see is that while NVIDIA are dead set on pushing AI as far as they can, AMD have taken a much simpler approach on getting their tech into the hands of gamers for an affordable price. And when it comes to the 9060 XT, it largely succeeds in offering a compelling mid-range option that balances performance, VRAM, and price, especially on the 16GB model, making it a strong contender for mainstream gamers in 2025. What is also clear to see is that after testing a lot of comparison cards and seeing strange quirks in certain games like Indiana Jones, 16GB is definitely now becoming the new norm. And I honestly feel like the 8GB version of this card will undoubtedly be dead on arrival. So yeah, there we have it. For now, that's going to wrap up this review of the new Radeon RX 9060 XT from AMD. We will have a more Sapphire-focused review in the near future and an XFX one in the near future with kind of more thoughts on the design, the specs, and well, why you should or shouldn't buy it over a reference spec. But for now, hopefully you enjoyed this one. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can help support everything we do by joining the Patreon family. You'll get access to a whole host of goodies, including exclusive behind-the-scenes content, game nights, meetups at the eTeknix offices, and much, much more. The link for all that good stuff is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.